But we might want to ask, who is Josephus the Jew? We've been learning about the diversity of Judaism, and Josephus helps us to see how Jesus is one figure among many, and how the early Jesus movement is one of many philosophies or sects that could be considered part of Judaism in the 1st century CE. A good way to conclude our talk today about the definition of Judaism is to mention how complicated Josephus's own Jewish identity is. Scholars of Josephus have over the centuries taken part in contentious debates about him. Josephus started out as a leader in the movement rebelling against Rome, but then went over to the Roman side and wrote histories of the so-called Jewish war under Roman imperial patronage at the pay of the Flavian emperors. He called himself a prophet. He was salaried by the Romans. Was he a traitor, a collaborator? His fuller name is Flavius Josephus, Flavius taken from the Roman imperial household that he served, that of the Flavian emperors, Vespasian and Titus. He has another name, Josephus ben Matthias, Josephus, son of the Jew Matthias. What does Josephus say about himself? He says that he was born of a distinguished priestly family in Jerusalem. We know that this was around the year 37 or so, a few years after the Roman execution of Jesus as a rebel. Josephus claims that he was descended from the Hasmoneans. You remember those great military leaders, rebels, and rulers. He claims that he was a child prodigy. At 14, he was consulted by chief priests, by leading men in the city on points of the law. He claims that he made rounds of Jewish philosophical schools and spent 3 years with a desert hermit, perhaps an Essene, training himself further. We know that he returned to Jerusalem in 55 or 56 to follow the Pharisees. He says that these resemble the Greek Stoic philosophy, and we're aware that in 63 or 64 he was chosen to serve as a member of a Jewish embassy to Rome to secure the release of imprisoned priests. He indicates that this allowed him to move in the highest Roman circles of the time in Nero's court. He wrote the Jewish War, which was composed when he was a dependent of the Flavian emperors in Rome. It's an account of a Jewish revolt suppressed by the Romans from 66 to 73. He also wrote the Antiquities in 20 volumes, the story of Jews from creation to the last procurators before the war with Rome. And he wrote as well a life, his own story, a defense against attacks from someone named Justus of Tiberias. His story is complicated, and there's the problem of his war years, where he gives conflicting accounts in the Jewish War that he wrote and in the life that he wrote. In the Jewish War, he talks about his role as a defender of a Jewish city and of the time he was captured by the Romans, how he had to serve the Romans during the siege of Jerusalem. He presents himself as an ideal general, elected by the people of Jerusalem at the outset of the revolt. He presents himself as a figure who trains Jewish men and fortifies cities. He claims that he confronts Vespasian, the soon-to-be emperor, in 67 CE. And he says that this great general recognizes him as preeminent. He says that by divine providence he escaped death. He was brought before Vespasian, and at that time he prophesied about Vespasian's imminent elevation to the imperial role. He's spared, and Vespasian, he writes, frees him. In other writings, Josephus presents himself in a really different way, as a reluctant participant in the Jewish revolt, as someone who tried to dampen revolutionary fervor among the Jews. It's hard to find the historical Josephus, and we have several accounts from his own pen. Was he the epic hero of the war, or was he the moderate aristocrat of the life that he wrote about himself? A better framework for reading Josephus, one that doesn't get us tangled in the question of whether he's a traitor, a collaborator, or a hero, might be borrowed from recent post-colonial theory. We can think of him in terms of hybridity. Under conditions of empire which long preceded him, Josephus becomes one of the Jewish elite who takes over, who adopts the rhetoric of Rome, who works in Rome's service to make his ethnos, his nation, comprehensible to Rome. He molds Judaism into a form that would be palatable to a Greco-Roman audience. In the end, he says about himself, "Never may I live to become so abject a captive as to abjure my race or forget the traditions of my forefathers." His writing about the varieties of Judaism as philosophies is part of that identity.